here on the Schwab Network. Let's bring in our next guest for our Cash Tag segment. That's going to be Megan Brantley, Vice President of Research at Likefolio. Welcome back to the show, Megan.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, so pertinent topic that we're talking about today, Disney. The stock's bounced off of those 9-year lows that we hit last year. This proxy fight, as I mentioned, is finally over, and I think that's every shareholder is kind of happy about that, especially with the gains that we've seen this year. But now, Megan, I look at it in the fact that, okay, the stock's up 32% this year. Now you've got to actually start performing to kind of sustain those gains. What kind of data are you guys seeing? Is this going to be supportive of the stock?
Yeah, so whenever we look at Disney, there are so many different areas that we can look into, and we really have key insight into 2 areas when it comes to this company. So that's its experiences, so consumers who are talking about going to one of its parks, taking a Disney cruise, and then also its streaming arm. So think about Hulu and Disney Plus and also ESPN. And I guess we can break down experiences first. And I think this is an area that we see consumers continue to prioritize. And you can see on this chart here, these are mentions from people who are talking about either booking a Disney vacation, going to Disney World, going to Disneyland, taking a Disney cruise. And those mentions are up by 42% year over year. We see a lot of this being driven by new interest in Disney's cruise line. And so, I think that we see that kind of across the board, this kind of resurgence in cruises that we've talked about, and Disney is certainly taking a piece of this. But Disney's also making significant investments to even expand some things at its Magic Kingdom and expand its experience offerings. And we think that this is a smart lean into that area where consumers want to spend. It's obviously doing a really good job of continuing to capture consumer interest in that area. So I think that this at least is a really positive thing for Disney. And then when we look at streaming, we do see some signs of improved happiness, which could be a good long-term indicator when it comes to its Hulu and its Disney Plus offerings. You can see this is the year-over-year change in those levels of consumer happiness. And a lot of this is being driven by new content that's being pushed on Hulu and Disney Plus. And some of it has to do with consolidation. We see, Disney making some smart moves and offering some Hulu content on the Disney Plus platform so that users aren't having to switch back and forth from different, streaming channels. But this is an area where we saw Disney Plus lose subscribers, but thankfully to price increases, they were able to offset some of those subscriber losses. But this is certainly the weakest area for Disney that we're watching for continued improvement. So it's nice to see some signs of happiness improvements here, but we definitely want to see more.
Megan, when you have a company the size of Disney, there's so many pieces. Some are always doing well and some are always struggling. There's always pieces of the business that aren't doing well. Getting streaming, linear TV, ESPN, getting that right. There's so many good positive things from ESPN. How about this stat? The women's game early this week
Iowa
had more viewers than the average for the NBA Finals.
Amazing. It was awesome.
That is, I don't know if that's a really good positive for the women or really bad for the NBA. But the NBA is coming back up again as their contract. And they're not going to take a pay cut. You know that. So ESPN has its struggles, but it looks like it's back on the upswing. But how long? Your data shows that there's still a lot of good things going on at Disney. How do they get everything going in the right direction, Megan?
I think that, this joint venture that Disney has going to really invest in live sports, that is really smart. And that's kind of what you're getting at with this ESPN Plus. And we see this as being, this is really the key driver, one of the biggest drivers of consumers that they say that they want to be able to watch live sports. And we've seen in our data that consumers aren't necessarily loyal to a platform, they're loyal to the content. So they will go wherever live sports are being broadcast in the best way, the easiest way to access, and increasingly, over the top streaming. And so it's smart of Disney to lean in here and really take advantage of this rising consumer interest. We see this really hurting names like Fubo long term that tried to carve out a niche in this live sports streaming that now Disney is going to be able to have more power, more control over. So I think that that's really smart. And also just improving its experiences. I think that that's a key area that at least short term we see consumers really really continuing to prioritize. So, being able to sustain, higher ticket prices and increasing that consumer spend while consumers are in one of its parks or on one of its cruise lines, I think is critical.
Megan, that 42% year over year on the experience mentions, because of the different silos they have. You mentioned the cruise lines, the parks, of course, and everything that Disney does. I know that streaming's still losing money at this point, but at what point will inflation start to really negatively affect? Because it's not cheap to go to Disney World. It's not cheap to go on these cruises, and those costs continue to rise. Is that going to be a headwind for this company when you start looking at mentions where, hey, I can't afford 2 trips to Disney this year with my kids. Maybe I'm only doing 1, or maybe I'm not doing any.
Yeah, that's something that we're definitely watching for, and that's why we're tracking these mentions in real time, and we're looking at web visits, and we aren't seeing that signs of a pullback yet, but that's certainly something to be aware of on the horizon, and that's something that we'll watch for any signs of weakness there, because I think that that's something, as you mentioned, the stock is up this year, that could negatively impact that growth. But so far, we aren't seeing signs of that pullback, at least when it comes to Disney. I think Disney is kind of in that upper echelon of experiences and maybe one of the last ones that consumers are willing to part with. But certainly something to be aware of, because in other areas, we are seeing some signs of a pullback in consumer spending.
Yep, I think it's going to be warranted on the consumer staying healthy at this point, because I think the parks and the cruise lines, those are still doing really well. They kind of set the tone. All right, great stuff. Great data as always, Megan. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
All right, that's Megan Brantley, Vice President of Research at Likefolio. Kev, we got to, I think the producer going to bring